What is democracy? Etymologically speaking, the word democracy comes from the two Greek words, demos, which means people, and kratos, which means power. Hence, democracy literally means power of the people. Put differently, democracy is a way of governing which depends on the will of the people. There are so many different models of democratic government around the world that it is sometimes easier to understand the idea of democracy in terms of what it definitely is not. Democracy, then, is not autocracy or dictatorship, where one person rules, and it is not oligarchy, where a small segment of society rules. Properly understood, democracy should not even be rule of the majority, if that means that the minority's interests are ignored completely. A democracy, at least in theory, is government on behalf of all the people, according to their will. The idea of democracy derives its moral strength, and to some extent, popular appeal, from two key principles, namely, individual autonomy and equality. On the one hand, individual autonomy espouses the idea that no one should be subject to rules which have been imposed by others. In other words, people should be able to control their own lives, within, of course, the bound of reason. Equality, on the other hand, espouses the idea that everyone should have the same opportunity to influence the decisions that affect people in society. As we can see, these principles, that is individual autonomy and equality, are intuitively appealing, and they help to explain why democracy is so popular. Of course, we feel it is fair that we should have as much chance as anyone else to decide on common rules. The problems arise when we consider how these principles can be put into practice, because we need a mechanism for deciding how to address conflicting views. Because it offers a simple mechanism, democracy tends to be rule of the majority, but rule of the majority can mean that some people's interests are never represented. A more genuine way of representing everyone's interests is to use decision-making by consensus, where the aim is to find common points of interest. The development of democracy in the ancient world. As is well known, the ancient Greeks are credited with creating the very first democracy, although there were almost certainly earlier examples of primitive democracy in other parts of the world. The Greek model was established in the 5th century BC, in the city of Athens. Among a sea of autocracies and oligarchies, which were the normal forms of government at the time, the Athenian model of democracy stood out. However, compared to how we understand democracy today, the Athenian model had two important differences, namely, first, theirs was a form of direct democracy. In other words, instead of electing representatives to govern on the people's behalf, the people themselves met, discussed questions of government, and then implemented policy. Second, such a system was possible partly because the people was a very limited category. Those who could participate directly were a small part of the population, since women, slaves, aliens, and of course, children, were excluded. The numbers who participated were still far more than in a modern democracy. For instance, 10,000 males engaged directly in politics, out of a population of around 200,000 people. Democracy in the modern world. Today, there are as many different forms of democracy as there are democratic nations in the world. But it must be noted that no two systems are exactly the same, and no one system can be taken as a model. For instance, there are presidential and parliamentary democracies, democracies that are federal or unitary, democracies that use a proportional voting system, and ones that use a majoritarian system, democracies which are also monarchies, and so on. But one thing that unites modern systems of democracy, and which also distinguishes them from the ancient model, is the use of representatives of the people. Instead of taking part directly in lawmaking, modern democracies use elections to select representatives who are sent by the people to govern on their behalf. Such a system is known as representative democracy. It can lay some claim to being democratic because it is, at least to some degree, based on the two principles above, namely, individual autonomy and equality. Democracy, participation, and rule of the majority. The most obvious ways to participate in government are to vote, or to stand for office and become a representative of the people. Democracy, however, is about far more than just voting, and there are numerous other ways of engaging with politics and government. The effective functioning of democracy, in fact, depends on ordinary people using these other means as much as possible. If people only vote once every 3 or 6 years, or do not vote at all, and if they do nothing else in the interim, then government really cannot be said to be by the people. It is hard to say that such a system is a democracy. It is important to note that there are two problems that are more intricately connected to the notion of representative democracy, and these concern minority interests. The first problem is that minority interests are often not represented through the electoral system. This may happen if their numbers are too few to reach the minimum level necessary for any representation. The second problem is that even if their numbers are represented in the legislative body, they will have a minority of representatives, and these may not, therefore, be able to summon up the necessary votes to defeat the majority representatives. For these reasons, democracy is often referred to as rule of the majority. It must be noted that the majority rule, if not backed up by a guarantee of human rights for all, can lead to decisions which are harmful to minorities, and the fact that these decisions are the will of the people can provide no justification. The basic interests of minorities, as well as majorities, need to be safeguarded in any democratic system by adherence to human rights principles, reinforced by an effective legal mechanism, whatever the will of the majority may be. Lastly, it is equally important to highlight another serious problem of democracy, and that is voter apathy. For a number of years, there has been concern about the status of democracy, perhaps particularly in the more established democracies. Much of this is based on the decreasing levels of citizen participation at elections, which appear to indicate a lack of interest and involvement on the part of citizens. As we can see, a low voter turnout calls into question the legitimacy of so-called democratically elected governments, which are, in some countries, actually elected by a minority of the total electorate.